This is the next in a series of videos on T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland. Hope you find it helpful. Today we're looking at the next section of the poem, Death by Water. As with my previous videos, we'll start by looking at this section's title before moving on to the lines. Since the title refers back to line 55, I'll largely repeat my comments about line 55 from my Burial of the Dead video, and some set up from my Ritual Romance video. There will be some quotes here that I didn't get to include in those videos, a little something new, but if you've already seen those videos, you can skip ahead using the timestamps. Central to the wasteland is the fertility rituals, and central to the fertility rituals is water. According to Weston, the fertility rituals were for the fertility of the animal, vegetable, and human worlds. The common element in all three is water. The need for water, this life-giving element, came to be so deeply felt by ancient peoples that it became embedded in the psyche and developed into something of spiritual significance, preserving of religious rites, in order to be obtained or retained. As an aside, how this happened no one can know, and all this is prehistorical. The religious rites Western documents are relatively late and however ancient, closer to our times. This is true across cultures, but Weston focuses on this phenomenon's expression through the Fisher King, who is also transcultural. It might be unfair to call the Fisher King an archetype, since Weston, and not only Weston, documents how religious ideas migrated, then varied, from Mesopotamia and Egypt to what we would call the West. With archetypes, there's supposed to be no contact between the cultures, and yet the same figures arise. To be moderate, it is fair to say that the Fisher King has archetypal significance, since that many cultures found the need and tendency to express this more-than-man figure in their religious practices when they encountered it from a new culture, when they could have expressed another figure or none. This is an ancient history. The Fisher King myth and rite still exist in Europe and across the world today, and not only in less modern societies. If we think of voting, how people across the world each believe their individual nations are going downhill, and how simply having the right man or woman in power will have the country right as rain. An anthropologist like Weston might say that this is a subconscious remnant of the Fisher King belief in action. All of life's deep need for water was perceived and internalized by ancient peoples, so we can understand the psyche's attachment to it. This attachment can express itself in modern and even scientific areas. For example, the search for intelligent life. When we hear of the search for intelligent life discussed, what is one of the first things astronomers look for? A planet with liquid water. For the larger part of human history, it was impossible to imagine life without water, and while biologically it makes sense to look for water, this search for water might be a psychological expression of our need for water, projected out into the cosmos. But there's also the spiritual view of this phenomenon and its attachments. For ancient peoples, water came to be associated with the Fisher King, God, deities, etc. It is the highest power or powers who control the waters. In Christianity, the Lord became synonymous with controlling waters and even being likened to water, the God of living waters, in Jeremiah 2:13 and 17:13. For my people have committed two evils. They have forsaken me, the fountain of living waters, and hewed them out cisterns, broken cisterns that can hold no water. O Lord, the hope of Israel, all that forsake thee shall be ashamed, and they that depart from thee shall be written in the earth, because they have forsaken the Lord, fountain of living waters. First control over water. We can think of Exodus 14, the parting of the Red Sea, and Exodus 17, of Moses, via the Lord, bringing water from a rock. For his people, there could be no greater miracles than controlling the sea and a rock, bringing forth water. Not that this image is unique to Christianity, we can find it in, for example, Euripides' Bacchae. One woman, taking her thyrsus, struck it against a rock, and from it a spring of fresh water leaps out. Still, it's miraculous. Returning to the Old Testament, in Exodus 14, it is interestingly enough water that literally and symbolically closes or is supposed to close the Egypt chapter for the Israelites when the sea becomes unparted, a way of putting Egyptian practices behind them, blocked by water. Those familiar with Herodotus will remember that Egypt was known for its polytheism and giving animal attributes to their gods, both of which are a no-go for the Old Testament God. And for Exodus 17, something, the most important thing, water, comes from its antithesis, rock. Such was the power of the Old Testament Lord. If we look at Isaiah, it along with the other Old Testament prophets' literature, went a long way in helping us understand section 1 of the wasteland. The Lord can be seen as a later development of the Fisher King, the tendency for this myth still residing in the subconscious. In Isaiah, the Lord controls the waters. For this is as the waters of Noah unto me, for I have sworn that the waters of Noah should no more go over the earth, so have I sworn that I would not be wroth with thee, nor rebuke thee. Then thou shalt see and flow together, and thine heart shall fear, and be enlarged, because the abundance of the sea shall be converted unto thee, the forces of the Gentiles shall come unto thee. Provides it. Ye made also a ditch between the two walls for the water of the old pool, but ye have not looked unto the maker thereof, neither had respect unto him that fashioned it long ago. Then shall he give the rain of thy seed, that thou shalt sow the ground withal, and the bread of the increase of the earth, and it shall be fat and plenteous. In that day shall thy cattle feed in large pastures. The beast of the field shall honor me, the dragon and the owls, because I give waters in the wilderness, and rivers in the desert, to give drink to my people, my chosen. And they thirsted not, when he led them through the deserts. He caused the waters to flow out of the rock for them. He clave the rock also, and the waters gushed out. And the Lord shall guide thee continually, and satisfy thy soul in drought, and make fat thy bones. And thou shalt be like a watered garden, and like a spring of water, whose waters fail not. For thus saith the Lord, Behold, I will extend peace to her like a river, and the glory of the Gentiles like a flowing stream. When the poor and needy seek water, and there is none, and their tongue faileth for thirst, I the Lord will hear them. I, the God of Israel, will not forsake them. I will open rivers in high places, and fountains in the midst of the valleys. I will make the wilderness a pool of water, and the dry land springs of water. Denies it. And I will lay it waste, it shall not be pruned nor digged, but there shall come briars and thorns. I will also command the clouds, that they rain no rain upon it. Through the wrath of the Lord of hosts is the land darkened, scorched. I will make waste mountains and hills, and dry up all their herbs. I will make the rivers islands, and I will dry up the pools. Behold, at my rebuke I dry up the sea, I make the rivers a wilderness. Their fish stinketh, because there is no water, and dieth for thirst. Art thou not it which hath dried the sea, the waters of the great deep, that hath made the depths of the sea a way for the ransomed to pass over, and is even likened to it? But there the glorious Lord will be unto us, a place of broad rivers and streams, wherein shall go no galley with oars, neither shall gallant ship pass thereby. These relationships are also displayed in the New Testament. For this they willingly are ignorant of, that by the word of God the heavens were of old, and the earth standing out of the water, and in the water, whereby the world that then was, being overflowed with water, perished. Returning to the Old Testament, the Lord's relationship to water is more complex. He has the agency to give or to withhold, and does so on moral grounds. The Fisher King was more two-dimensional. He was an agent of water. If the land was dead and dying, one performed rites to him, for him to heal via water the land. He seemingly wouldn't choose to say no if one performed the rites. But with the Old Testament God, he actually spurns religious rites because he sees them as superficial gestures or diversions from his people's bad morals. Still, both the Fisher King and the Lord brought and had powerful relationships to water. Water is a needed element. This is something perceived by ancient peoples long ago and is still with us. It is part of the reason why The Wasteland is such a powerfully felt poem. Here I'm thinking of lines 19 to 30 and 331 to 359. In an earlier video, I said that in the poem, water is positive and fire is negative. There is a more nuanced way of saying this, however. When the lack of water is felt, it assumes a positive quality, but for the most part, it is a negative or something to be feared. For clarification of my ideas, it is the first sentence of Williamson's quote that I'd emphasize. How the second sentence is true, we can look at next. Water is a powerful element. One could argue that the reason we, historically, have held dear the gods we hold dear is because our beliefs in their powers to control, not just dispense, this powerful element. Though but a moment's consideration will teach that however baby man may brag of his science and skill, and however much in a flattering future that science and skill may augment, yet forever and forever, to the crack of doom, the sea will insult and murder him, and pulverize the stateliest, stiffest frigate he can make. Nevertheless, by the continual repetition of these very impressions, man has lost that sense of the full awfulness of the sea, which aboriginally belongs to it. That same sea rolls now, that same ocean destroyed the wrecked ships of last year. Yeah, foolish mortals, Noah's flood is not yet subdued. 2/3 of the fair world it yet covers. No mercy, no power, but its own controls it. Panting and snorting like a mad battle steed that has lost its rider, the masterless ocean overruns the globe. Compare this with Mark 4, in which Christ controls the wind and the sea, this chapter ending with, "And they were filled with awe, and said to one another, Who then is this, that even the wind and sea obey him?" Of which the commentary tells us, Jesus manifests his divinity by exercising authority over nature. According to the Old Testament, God alone has the power to subdue the raging seas. We can also note how Eliot himself felt about this element. A river, a very big and powerful river, is the only natural force that can wholly determine the course of human peregrination. At sea, the wanderer may sail, be carried by winds and currents in one direction or another, but the river with its strong, swift current is the dictator to the raft or to the steamboat. It may obliterate the low Illinois shore to a horizon of water, while in its bed it runs with a speed such that no man or beast can survive in it. At such times, it carries down human bodies, cattle, and house. The river is never wholly chartable. It changes its pace, it shifts its channel unaccountably. Thus the river makes the book a great book. As with Conrad, we are continually reminded of the power and terror of nature, and the isolation and feebleness of man. Conrad remains always the European observer of the tropics, the white man's eye contemplating the Congo. But Mark Twain is a native, and the river god is his god. It is as a native that he accepts the river god, and it is the subjection of man that gives to man his dignity, for without some kind of god, man is not even very interesting. We are probably getting a lot more Eliot than we are Twain in this interpretation, but for our purposes, the commentary is cogent. Hopefully we've seen enough to understand water's positive importance and connection to divinities, and additionally connect the sea/rivers or water's more dangerous aspect and manifestations to danger. In the wasteland, we have the warning, "Fear death by water," at line 55. Thus water, this element that for all of human history has been a positive, a godsend, albeit sometimes dangerous, which we have buried in our psyches and likened gods to it, has become a negative. To understand why this is so, we must look at this line's context. In my first video, I stated the major themes of westerns from ritual to romance, and how the ancient fertility symbols or figures undergo a transformation from those of the medieval romances. Except there is one figure in the latter that's absent or neglected in the former, the sage figure. Before returning to line 55, let's look at the sage figure from the romances to appreciate his function. At the core of this saga cycle is the figure of Merlin. He represents for the West something which in other cultures is a frequent and compelling personage, the magician as a teacher and guide of souls. He is comparable, for example, to the guru as the house priest and master of initiation ceremonies in India, or to the medicine man as the oracle and spiritual leader of the primitive tribe. His prophetic eyes can watch the images of the future unroll as well as those of the present, and he knows what is to come to pass. Weston does not explicitly cover this element in her book, but the sage figure does have its antecedent in the fertility rituals, in the figures of priests, medicine men, or initiators into the mysteries. If we remember in Eliot's poem, degradation is a recurring theme. The elements from the rituals and rites have been debased. Additionally, as I've noticed since the beginning that the poem functions as a from romance to ritual, the poem is skewing the ancient rituals' later developments, or even further developing them, in place of a return to the primitive. For example, the Holy Grail returning to a red rock. On the degradation theme, it's only natural that Merlin, the sage figure, would experience a lowering in the wasted land. This is what leads us into line 55's context. Madame Sosostris and Tarot/Astrology. In section 1, we have our modern equivalent of Merlin, tarot reader, who also dabbles in astrology. Now tarot does have its noble antecedents in finding and predicting water, positive, yet this is the opposite of Sosostris' warning of deterrent to water. So what happened? A few things, from minor to major. First, unlike Yeats, Eliot did not like the magic arts. I'm sorry to hear that the wasteland has caused the rifling of tarot packs. Still, the use of such cards for divination is certainly a black art, forbidden to the faithful. We are, at least officially, prohibited from consulting the oracles and from having our horoscopes cast in the Tottenham Court Road. Given Eliot's conservative religious background, this makes sense. Second, even if we go against Eliot and hold tarot and astrology as authentic arts, most of us can acknowledge that these arts, as they are largely held today, are commercialized, watered-down shells of what they once were, whether looking at their uses as documented in From Ritual to Romance or later periods. For the former, we have evidence for this in Weston's notes on tarot in her book, to be contrasted against how tarot is presented in Eliot's poem. And for the latter, the horoscope at line 58. The horoscope might mean the horoscope section in the daily newspaper, so consulting the stars via a newspaper, a commercialized product, is rather inauthentic. I say might because there is evidence suggesting that astrology was not published in British newspapers. Astrologers and other fortune tellers, crystal gazers, tarot readers, and the like frequently arrested and brought before the courts on charges of fraud. In 1921, for instance, the Times of London mentions no fewer than 5 such cases, the mails being used illegally. In the U.S., astrology was published in early 1900s newspapers. I take it for granted this would have been the case elsewhere, but even if it were not so in the UK, Eliot was born and raised in the US, so he may have carried this idea overseas. And third, in my Burial of the Dead video, I do a line-by-line look as to how and why we are to interpret Sesostris as a sham, but also as something ominous. Sham diviners are not unique to modernity. Again, if we look at Isaiah, we find, "And the spirit of Egypt shall fail in the midst thereof, and I will destroy the counsel thereof, and they shall seek to the idols, and to the charmers, and to them that have familiar spirits, and to the wizards." That this is a rebellious people, lying children that will not hear the law of the Lord, which say to the seers, See not, and to the prophets, Prophesy not unto us the right things, speak unto us smooth things, prophecy deceits, get you out of the way, turn aside out of the path, cause the Holy One of Israel to cease from before us. Stand now with thine enchantments, and with the multitude of thy sorceries, therein thou hast labored from thy youth. If so be, thou shalt be able to profit. If so be, thou mayest prevail. Thou art wearied in the multitude of thy counsels. Let now the astrologers, the stargazers, the monthly prognosticators, stand up and save thee from these things that shall come upon thee. These shams not only offer no spiritual truths, but act as diversions from true spiritual messages. Yet it is unfair to blame only such shams, since the people/consumers at some level know this, according to the Old Testament. This is the background that I believe Eliot wants us to have in mind when we read the Sesostris lines. She's not a genuine sage figure because there are things, genuine things, that she cannot see. Here, she's to be contrasted to Tiresias, the poem's second sage figure, a genuine one, and the irony in that Tiresias can see more than Sesostris, who sees things as blank or is forbidden to see. She is also ominous or wicked because she deters from the life-giving element, water. The wasted lands need healing or rebirth, but this is not to be taken so literally or spatially because what was once a literal or spatial problem is now one of the interior or inner self, thanks to modernism, by which I mean modernist literature, and its emphasis on consciousness or the inner world. We get this literature, stream of consciousness, in the works of Joyce, Woolf, and Faulkner, for example. The Wasteland, also modernist, is about the individual soul's pilgrimage to a spiritual truth or itself, not for the salvation of the material worlds of the vegetable, animal, and human, as it once had been, but this is more evident in section 5. From her perspective, the secular perspective of course, the journey to healing and rebirth is dangerous, hence the warning, fear death by water. There is here an entirely cogent logic which should not be taken for granted nor easily villainized for the following. Secular society values peace and security above all else, it rightly being the lowest common denominator across the board, observed by early modern political thinkers like Hobbes. This thought is also mentioned in Thomas Mann's The Magic Mountain. The fear of death went back to a very low cultural stage, when violent death was the rule, and its horrors thus became associated with the idea of death in general. But now, thanks to the development of hygiene and the increase in personal security, the natural death was the rule, violent one the exception. Modern man had come to think of repose, after exhaustion of his powers, as not at all dreadful, but normal and even desirable. I've connected elements of this novel to those of The Wasteland before. I will connect the novel more strongly to this poem in my Section 5 video. Returning to peace and security, both are just as valued now as they were in the time of Isaiah, with sham sages also comforting their peoples then. Hobbes rightly observed recorded history and knew that it consistently metes out war and tribulation, hence death, another lowest common denominator. Hence, there could be no higher society than one that defied history, one that achieved relative peace and security for a relatively long time, or one that assuaged the fear of death through peace and security. Also keep in mind that historically, many of the wars, conflicts, and violence across the earth have been over religion in some form or to some degree. For the sake of common worship, they have slain each other with the sword. They have set up gods and challenged one another, "Put away your gods, and come and worship ours, or we will kill you and your gods." And so it will be to the end of the world. Even when gods disappear from the earth, they will fall down before idols just the same. Although it needs to be said that for the Dostoevsky quote, it's man's insecurity and insatiable need for common worship that creates the conflict more than the need for worship itself. And as Jung clarifies or modernizes, our fearsome gods have only changed their names. They now rhyme with ism. In his Nietzsche lectures, Heidegger, in discussing the history of metaphysics, comments on the dethronement of what was once highest, the Christian God, by observing how the idea of God has lost the power to shape history. This idea no longer moves history in the ways it did in ancient Rome, the Crusades, the religious wars of England, etc. But there still are wars, and it's only relatively recently wars have not been about religion, at least overtly. Instead, other ideas are in the place of the idea of God, yet attached to these ideas is that same religious impulse and intensity of previous times. As Eliot says elsewhere, we have found that the improvement of man as man is an empty phrase, unless we can agree about what is improvement, and that we cannot agree about this unless we find a common answer to the question, what is man? Now, we cannot expect to agree to one answer to this question, for with this question, our differences will turn out in the end to be religious differences, and it does not matter whether you are a religious person or not, or whether you expressly repudiate everything that you call a religion. There will be some sort of religious attitude, even if you call it a non-religious attitude, implied in your answer. Maturing this religious impulse or channeling it into something non-religious and non-dangerous is not without its merits. So when we return to Sesostris and her warning, there could be something in her, in good faith, in the collective consciousness, that correctly views any pilgrimage or quest as dangerous. However, The Wasteland being a religious poem, the religious view has the first and final say. Literally, in the poem, it has the first and final say. Thus that which in the secular world leads to death is something actually positive, and that which deters from death, or warning, is negative. On how things are reversed, we might think of Christ's words in Matthew. For whoever will save his life shall lose it, and whoever will lose his life for my sake shall find it. Also Galatians 6:14, But God forbid that I should glory, save in the cross of our Lord Jesus Christ, by whom the world is crucified, dead unto me, nigh unto the world. And another source that I will be quoting later, Angela Silesius. Security causes loss. Stand fast, keep vigil, pray. Wrapped in security, many a man has lost bliss in eternity. If this life means death, and death means life dichotomy seems ironic, we need only remember that irony is another one of the poem's themes, while also remembering the particular religion poem has as a background, prehistoric fertility rituals, so by death this largely means rebirth, which is needed. Still there's a danger. Her warning is ominous because of the word death, and because the life element water, and what it symbolizes, is now dangerous. Another word we have to discuss is drowned in line 47, obviously explained in line 55 with fear death by water. For all her faults, Sesostris rightly predicts, as we will see, the manner of death in section 4. When Madame Sesostris says, "Here is your card," at line 46-47, by your, is she speaking to a character, or more interestingly, directly to the reader, as in second-person fiction, in which the reader is the protagonist? Is this an invitation from Eliot to you, line 321, to take up the quest for water, or what it now, taken less literally, symbolizes? On the Wasteland, Kenner states, The past exists in fragments precisely because nobody cares what it meant. It will unite itself and come alive in the mind of anyone who succeeds in caring, who is unwilling that Shakespeare shall remain the name attached only to a few tags everyone half remembers, in a world where we know too much and are convinced of too little. Eliot develops the nightmare journey with consummate care, and then maneuvers the reader into the position of the quester, presented with a terminal heap of fragments, which it is his business to inquire about. The protagonist in the poem perhaps does not inquire. They are fragments he has shored against his ruins. Perhaps he does inquire. He has at least begun to put them to use, and the arid plain is at length behind him. In this card reading, the protagonist's fate is connected to water. Perhaps for those who also seek to leave the wasted land, it will be likewise. Towards Section 4's end, it is evident that there is a water journey, or its beginnings, so it seems that the pilgrim disregarded Sesostris' warning. As I noted in my Section 3 videos, this water journey need not be interpreted so literally or spatially. It could be that the soul is representing its journey by the water topographies towards Section 3's end, but there is a journey out and away from the wasted land, nonetheless. Let's look at lines 311 to 321. Phlebas the Phoenician, fortnight dead, forgot the cry of gulls in the deep sea swell, and the profit and the loss, and a current under the sea picked his bones in whispers. As he rose and fell, he passed the stages of his age and youth, entering the whirlpool. Gentile or Jew, O you who turned the wheel and looked to windward, consider Phlebas, who was once handsome and tall as you. At first it seems not to offer much, the section being only 10 lines. However, I'll make 4 points, 3 holistic, 1 general. First point, the 10 lines that we have are once part of a longer passage about sailing and a shipwreck. Ezra Pound, in his editorial position, gutted most of it. Yet when Eliot considered deleting the entire section, Pound advised against it. When Eliot was back in London, he wrote to Pound with various queries, and among them, perhaps better omit Phlebas too, to which Pound replied, I do advise keeping Phlebas. In fact, I more than advise. Phlebas is an integral part of the poem. The card pack introduces him, the drowned Phoenician sailor, and he is needed absolutely where he is, must stay in. Second point, if you're a fan of Eliot or have been reading his poems, Section 4 may look familiar because it is adapted from Eliot's Dans le Restaurant, the last stanza. Eliot repurposed more than a few of his earlier poems, published and unpublished, into the wasteland. As for Dans le Restaurant, I'll spare reading it in French and instead provide a translation. Phlebas the Phoenician, the fortnight drowned, forgot the cry of gulls and the swell of the Cornish seas, and the profit and the loss, and the cargo of tin, and the undersea current carried him far, took him back through the ages of his past. Imagine it, a terrible end, for a man once so handsome and tall. Third point, I did say almost identical, because there are thematic differences. Williamson, in his book on Eliot, believes Section 4 to be so important that he begins his analysis of the wasteland itself by examining Dans le Restaurant. Some consideration of Dans le Restaurant is relevant, if not imperative, to a discussion of the wasteland, not merely because its conclusion provides the fourth part of the larger poem, rather because, as I ventured to think, it is a conclusion in that poem also, the dramatic conclusion to its negative movement. This conjecture and the fact that it was translated so as to form a distinct part of the new poem suggests that there is a similarity in the sequence of both poems. The nature of this sequence first becomes clear in Dans le Restaurant, but it is the negative development of the La Figa experience, which in that poem remains equivocal. The last section of this poem, produced with slight changes as part 4 of the Wasteland, supplies the foreign old waiter with his ultimate cleansing. Phlebas, still the trading Phoenician, is drowned, deprived of his lust and greed. It was a painful fate, yet he was once handsome and tall as you. But the wasteland omits the cargo tin, is not explicit about the painful fate, and less specific about the passing of the stages of his prior life. It adds details like, picked his bones in whispers, a rather grim cleansing image, and specifies the audience as those who turn the wheel and look to windward, as a homogeneous image of those who resemble Phlebas the sailor. In the wasteland, the experience of the old waiter becomes relevant to the whole land, at once the Fisher King myth and the modern reality. For Williamson, Dans le Restaurant is more like a proto-The Wasteland, for in both, there is something dirty that needs to be cleansed. In the minor poem, there was a sleazy episode before the water cleansing episode. In the Wasteland, there were the lust vignettes in Part 3, before Part 4, with its cleansing episode. The change in development from the smaller poem to the Wasteland is largely a horizontal one, because the vision expands from the problem of, to quote Williamson, from one person to expressive of the whole land. Yet I'll add that the wasteland develops a vertical change, with the Baudelairean, Dantean, and religious dimensions in section 1 and 5. Another reason why I shared Williamson is because he may be the original source, on the same page quoted above, of my From Romance to Ritual interpretation. The latent intention of the wasteland might be called a reversal of Miss Weston's title, to translate romance back into its meaning as ritual. In her scheme, the experience of sex, like that of Phlebas, assumes a universal religious significance. It is connected with the state of the land, for the vegetation myths erect the cycle of the seasons into a series of divinely ordered events, and this cycle of life is based on sex and personified in ritualistic figures. The fortune of the land depends upon the treatment of these figures, thus upon religion. Up until this video, I hadn't read Williamson's book on Eliot, so I picked up the From Romance to Ritual idea from another source who may or may not have been quoting Williams. In any event, now we know for those looking to cite their sources. Fourth point, when studying any great text, the text always consists of peaks and valleys. Our first few times reading Plato's Republic, Paradise Lost, The Critique of Pure Reason, Moby Dick, Magic Mountain, most of us focus on the peaks, the big events that even those who have never read the text know about. Yet a good book, or a good poem, also consists of quieter moments, like section 4 here. I would say sections 1, 3, and 5 are the poem's peaks, and sections 2 and 4 are its valleys. Remember this imagery for section 5. As for our lines, in the Eliot literature, the meaning of the name Phlebas takes two directions. The first is etymological. The name Phlebas may be derived from the Latin adjective flabilis, meaning lamentable, to be wept over. This does fit given section 4's final tone, the words consider who was once handsome and tall, being very memento mori. The second connects Phlebas with Plato's Philebus. In this dialogue, Philebus is a hedonist. In the scholarship where Phlebas is connected to Philebus, it's done so with no other commentary, so the assumed connection scholars would want us to make is that Phlebas is also a hedonist. In the poem in which there's more to go on, Phlebas is connected to Mr. Eugenides. This is something I'll explain in a moment. While on Plato, I've been surprised by the amount of attention to Philebus and not to the Republic given this line. And the same may be said of the love of knowledge, which is the special characteristic of our part of the world, or of the love of money, which may, with equal truth, be attributed to the Phoenicians and Egyptians. I will strongly connect Phlebas to money given this insight. Even his Smyrna merchant, pocket full of currents can be heard as currents, which dissolve entities and definitions like the current under sea that picks the bones of Phlebas, his Phoenician alter ego. Huff, in his essay on the wasteland, however, is rather chiding about establishing this phonetic connection. And we are even bidden to observe that the currents which pick the drowned Phlebas bones have a forerunner in the currents, in the pocket of Mr. Eugenides, the Smyrna merchant, surely the last refuge of baffled imbecility. Yet if we side with Ellman and see the current at line 315 to be connected to the currents at line 210, comment about Phlebas and Eugenides being alter egos has merit. We can see this back and forth with the chart posted on screen. First row is straightforward. In the second row, in the Shakespeare allusion, we have the riches, pearls, under the water contrasted to the currents, money, under the sea. Third row, similarly here money and current compared to teeth and bones. Next line, again, currents and current. Fifth row, CIF, which supposedly stands for cost and insurance freight. Though I'll make a point about this much later in a bonus video. It's contrasted to profit and loss. Sixth row, Mr. Good Genius compared to handsome and tall. And seventh row, again oil and tar emanating from the water, contrasted to the currents, money, under the water. The connection isn't limited to the Phlebas-Eugenides pair, but also to Lil or Lil Phlebas, if we consider money and signs of mortality. Before continuing, I'll admit that my section 4 interpretation is the loosest of all the sections. There's evidence for it, of course, but I don't find it to be very strong. Also, it's the weakest in relevance to my From Romance to Ritual interpretation of the poem. I base most of what follows on the appearance of money versus the water element in section 4 to be compared with section 2, the city versus the wind element. Both elements function similarly, as destructive, yet not necessarily without their purposes for doing so. Let me backtrack to 2 prior points, each from earlier videos. In my game of chess video, I noted how section 2 is less elemental than the others, natural given that it takes place in the city. Its element is still wind, though wind under the door at line 118, signifying mortality. City life, despite modern accomplishment and technological innovation, is still ephemeral, no less subject to time and destruction than anything else man ever accomplished. We can think of the song, Dust in the Wind. There are other connections to air in Section 2, shared in my Section 2 video, but the following is one that I share with some reluctance. It is a connection one can make only by comparing the published Section 2 to its original version entitled In the Cage. My original intentions were to make this video series without utilizing the Wasteland's original drafts, published as the Wasteland Facsimile. The poem as we know it gives us enough to work with, but to lend evidence to my interpretation for Section 4, I'll share the following. The first title, for a game of chess, was In the Cage, a phrase immediately suggesting isolation, confinement, and entrapment. Recalling the epigram from Petronius, it evokes both the Sibyl's cage and her longing for death, because life is empty and without hope. Unlike the later title, moreover, it suggests the dominant image of air and death in air, hanging helplessly in nothingness. Critics have pointed out other sources for this title, which are also suggestive in other ways. Henry James wrote a story entitled In the Cage. As with the Sibyl, there was the promise of so much, immortality, contrasted to air, death, nothingness. Section 4 will be like Section 2, with its theme of city elements to be contrasted to futility, except this city element is the promise of money, or money in general. It is also worth noting that the first words of Section 4, Death by Water and Phoenician, take place in the city, in Section 1. In the 19th century, in the U.S., wealth was sought out in the gold rush, in which pioneers set out to establish wealth by breaking from their cities, towns, communities, and heading west into nature. But by the 20th century, the gold rush had died down, and with the exception of oil deposits, establishing wealth meant to return to, or staying in, or establishing cities. In Europe there was no gold rush, but securing and mining natural resources. But as in the U.S. in the 20th century, wealth was to be sought in the city, via business, housing, stocks, etc. In the poem, something absent from Section 2 that's symbolic of city life is money, being only marginally present. We can infer wealth in the Cleopatra knockoff at the beginning, and there is a mention of money in line 143. Money was present in Section 3 in Eugenides, and we have already looked at the financial connection between Eugenides and Flavius. More than alter egos, I put forward this paired function like before and after snapshots, the first being a money-chasing hedonist, and the second, mortar coil, not unique to Eugenides, but this is to be covered at the end. There are other connections to money in Section 3, at 259, the O city, according to Rooks and McHugh. Neither the capitalization nor the punctuation within the phrase is that of Baudelaire. The city of London, with its uppercase C, is the financial center of the city, that is London. T.S. Eliot corrected lowercase city to capital city in the phrase, I'm extremely busy at my vocation in the city. And at 296 for Moorgate, the gate was demolished in 1762, and the quarter to which it gave its name is now the heart of the financial district of the city. If we connect the city to money, we should be reminded of Section 1, lines 62 to 70, the scene of the crowd heading over the bridge and to work, the name Stetson, and the ships of Malai. Since I've already covered these lines in the Section 1 video, I'll share 3 brief quotes from Hayward, put into context our topic, money. King William Street is the street running from the north side of the bridge into the heart of the city. There is no special significance in the name Stetson. It is simply a typical name for a businessman. The great naval victory of the Romans over the Carthaginians in the First Punic War, a trade war. There may be other references to money in the poem, but I believe this is sufficient. Section 3 is on passion, specifically lust. Yet as in the comment I ended my previous video, passion can find expression and vehicle in anything and everything. In the Buddha sermon, the whole world is described as being on fire, and it is only by the absence of passion that one becomes free. I would argue that, coming from sections 2 and 3, one of the objects of passion that we need to be mindful of is money, or in passion, greed. Let's begin the process of connecting money and greed to section 4. First, by only looking briefly at Eliot, the person, we know that he worked at a bank for 8 years. I want to find out something about the science of money while I am at it. It is an extraordinarily interesting subject. This speaks more to his attitude toward learning on the topic at hand, not any character flaw, at least relating to money. Next, what Eliot said on the topic of money. Perhaps the dominant vice of our time, from the point of view of the church, will be proved to be avarice. Surely there is something wrong in our attitude towards money. The acquisition, rather than the creative and spiritual instincts, are encouraged. The fact that money is always forthcoming for the purpose of making more money, whilst it is so difficult to obtain for the purposes of exchange, and for the needs of the most needy, is disturbing to those who are not economists. I am by no means sure it is right for me to improve my income by investing in the shares of a company, making I know not what, operating perhaps thousands of miles away, and in the control of which I have no effective voice, but which is recommended as a sound investment. I am still less sure of the morality of my being a moneylender, that is, of investing in bonds and debentures. I know that it is wrong for me to speculate, but where the line is to be drawn between speculation and what is called legitimate investment is by no means clear. I seem to be a petty usurer, in a world manipulated largely by big usurers, and I know that the Church once condemned these things, and I believe that modern war is chiefly caused by some immorality of competition which is always with us in times of peace. And until this evil is cured, no leagues, or disarmaments, or collective security, or conferences, or conventions, or treaties will suffice to prevent it. Eliot's specifically solely Christian or societal writings are not that interesting in my opinion. Every now and then you may find a gem, but a gem to be connected to his poetry, not in itself. For our purposes, the phrases avarice, surely there is something wrong with our attitude to money, and modern war are sufficient. Now the first two are nothing new, but the modern war we can connect to Plato and his Republic. Eliot was no stranger to Plato. For example, in college, when recommending Eliot for a Sheldon Fellowship, Woods wrote, he, Eliot, wrote the best papers in the Plato course. Also, original drafts of The Wasteland have references to Adeimantus and Glaucon from Plato's Republic, who with Socrates were creating a city in speech or unreal city of their own. So we know that Eliot had read or was reading their Republic while working on The Wasteland. For my part, I would like to believe that Eliot had read or thought about this passage from the Republic in connection to The Wasteland. Socrates. All right, I understand. It isn't merely the origins of a city that we are considering, it seems, but those of a city that is luxurious too, and that may not be a bad idea, for by examining such a city, we might perhaps see how justice and injustice grow up in cities. Yet the true city, in my view, is the one we have described, the healthy one, as it were. But if you also want to look at a feverish city, so be it. There is nothing to stop us. Then we will have to enlarge our city again. The healthy one is no longer adequate. On the contrary, we must now increase it in size and population and fill it with a multitude of things that go beyond what is necessary for a city, hunters for example, and all those imitators. Many of the latter work with shapes and colors, many with music, poets and their assistants, rhapsodes, actors, choral dancers, theatrical producers, and there will have to be craftsmen of multifarious devices, including among other things, those needed for the adornment of women. In particular then, we will need more servants, don't you think? Such as tutors, wet nurses, nannies, beauticians, barbers, and relish cooks, and meat cooks too. Moreover, we will also need people to farm pigs. This animal did not exist in our earlier city, since there was no need for it, but we will need it in this one, and we will also need large numbers of other meat-producing animals, won't we? And if someone is going to eat them. Glaucon, we certainly will. Socrates, and if we live like that, won't we have a far greater need for doctors than we did before? Glaucon, yes, far greater. Socrates, and the land, I take it, that used to be adequate to feed the population we had then, will now be small and inadequate, don't you agree? Glaucon, I do. Socrates, won't we have to seize some of our neighbors' land then, if we are to have enough for pasture and plowing? And won't our neighbors want to seize part of ours in turn, if they too have abandoned themselves to the endless acquisition of money and overstepped the limit of their necessary desires? Glaucon, yes, that is quite inevitable, Socrates. Socrates, and the next step will be war, Glaucon. Don't you agree? Glaucon, I do. Socrates, now let's not say yet whether the effects of war are good or bad, but only that we have now found the origin of war. It comes from those same factors, the occurrence of which is the source of the greatest evils for cities and the individuals in them. Glaucon, indeed it does. Socrates, the city must be further enlarged then, my dear Glaucon, and not just a little, but by the size of a whole army. We will do battle with the invaders in defense of the city's wealth and of all the other things that we just described. The lines, feverish city, if they too have abandoned themselves to the endless acquisition of money and overstepped the limit of their necessary desires, we have not found the origin of war, the source of the greatest evils, and we will do battle with invaders in defense of the city's wealth are our focus. Again, I would like to believe that Eliot at some level is drawing from his Plato knowledge in section 4. Plato tells us how much of what we have in our cities is unnecessary, its origins are in overstepped desires, its most common expression is in wealth acquisition, and the greatest conflict, war, is its most extreme extension. As a preview, when we get to the section 5 video, remember the city life, the idea of the city as this arena of passions, and contrast it to section 5's dominant background and its association of ideas, physically and teleologically. The first 3 points should remind us of the poem so far. The fourth point is not as interesting in my opinion, but it needs to be said, even if in passing, that the wasteland was created with the First World War in its background. As an aside, if anyone is interested in other connections between war and wealth, I'd recommend the earlier quoted Eleanor Cook's T.S. Eliot and the Carthaginian piece. Cook focuses on Roman wars and World War I and their connections to wealth and desires. If I ever post another series on the wasteland, I will introduce some of her analysis. Plato's thoughts on war and wealth are secular wisdom, yet how common is it with a verse everyone has heard at some point in their lives? For the love of money is the root of all evil, which while some coveted after, they have erred from the faith, and pierced themselves through with many sorrows. Hundreds of years of religious teachers and teachings almost sound like broken records in their homilies against worldly passions, in particular, the greed for wealth. So I will not overquote as I did with the biblical quotes, which are more textually connected to the poem. What I do want to draw attention to is an element in some such homilies, mainly how ephemeral money is as viewed when compared to death. Vanity are all the works and quests of man, and they have no being after death is come. Our wealth is with us no longer, how can our glory go with us? For when death has come, all these things are vanished clean away. Where is now our affection for earthly things? Where is now the alluring pomp of transient questing? Where is now our gold and our silver? Where is now the surging crowd of domestics and their busy cries? All is dust, all is ashes, all is shadow. Wherefore draw near, that we may cry to our immortal King, Lord, your everlasting blessings vouchsafe unto him, her, that has now gone away, bringing him, her, to repose in that blessedness which never grows old. This hymn is by St. John of Damascus. Apparently it is also an elegy or funeral hymn. I share this because it connects with the name Phlebas, which means lament, and section 4's memento mori tone. In comparing the two, there are also some words and ideas quite similar, not that Eliot was drawing from this hymn. Rather, memento mori motifs, its symbols, are part of the collective unconscious. I'll share an alternative translation of this hymn for line 321. This was all mostly to connect section 4 to section 2, how wealth in the city is undermined by the wind element in the latter, and how money is likewise undermined by the water element in the former. Water is more effective, I think, in its work because it is also a life element. Ironically, in section 2, the city is more connected to life, yet is more like a city of the dead. Again, I'd say the city, that is, the idea of the modern city, is still undermined by the wind under the door, not to mention the need for the air that freshened from the window. One final recap of water's importance. Unlike money or wealth, water is one of the 4 elements, which goes back eons and across cultures. Water is more precious than money. See my previous videos on this aspect, and also upcoming section 5 video. In post-apocalyptic films, we see just how precious water becomes. Even in science fiction, it's this way, partly because the characters are still human despite advanced technology in the plots. At the other end, it is also a plot device in our westerns. In our psyches and religions, water is connected to the divine. By contrast, when money speaks to our souls, or is connected to religion, as criticized in religious teachings, it is of a life gone astray. In the time Obed, he begun a cursing at the folks, for their being dull sheep and praying to a Christian heaven, as it didn't help him none. He told him he'd known of folks as prayed to gods that give him something you really need, and says if a good bunch of men would stand by him, he could maybe get a hold of certain powers, as it bring plenty of fish and quite a bit of gold. There are probably better examples, like Matthew 23:16-17, except this one is one of the more interesting ones, for its subversion. The people selling themselves for gold is standard, yet fish and water in this story actually retaining their religious dimensions while undermining Christianity is rather novel. Yet even when it's being subverted, there's no getting away from water's religion-invoking power, or the fish as a life symbol, as covered in my first video. True, in the poem water also means death, but to paraphrase Williamson, The water doesn't only drown, it also saves. After death by water, representing the fate of this card, the agony of the protagonist is intensified, and he turns from the water that drowns to the water that saves. Another scholar has the same sentiment. Eliot is offering an alternative to death by water in an ancient epic. Water can destroy, but it can also revivify. I would only add that this death functions as a baptism, however late in life, for Phlebas, again connecting water to the religious, prehistoric religions, religious rites, etc. Thematically, this section also shows a needed cooling off coming from section 3. This out of the way, let's look at section 4's lines individually. We've covered Phlebas the Phoenician, both Phlebas and Phoenician. The a fortnight dead, I believe, is supposed to, surprisingly enough, come as a relief. Phlebas is literally dead, not like the living dead marching to work in section 1, the dead to each other's spouses in section 2, nor the machine-like lovers in section 3. In contrast to other sections, section 4 is rather peaceful, despite involving death. This could also be because there has to be death before there can be rebirth. The line, "I forgot the cry of gulls, and the deep sea swell, and a current under the sea picked his bones and whispers," is meant to place the protagonist pilgrim in water. By being introduced to and placed under the water, not the frozen water akin to death, and the desire for it in section 1, this water could function as a baptism, cleansing. Or if we go back to Western and prehistoric religious rites, she states that Fisher King effigies were thrown to the waters as part of resurrection rituals. I have previously remarked on the from romance to ritual interpretation of this poem, the return to the primitive, because of the universal appeal and force that this brings. I wonder whether there is something of the same taking place in Phlebas in this section. I am not an anthropologist, so if anyone knows more about this, please add it in the comments, but I believe that effigies are actually a later development of the rites and in general. Effigies are a symbolism, yet first peoples probably didn't have the understanding for symbolism, so it is not difficult to imagine that the first effigies were not effigies at all. Instead, were enacted on whom effigies would only later represent. For example, perhaps the first ailing Fisher Kings were literally thrown into the water. Then later, when practices did not have to be so literal, or could afford to be not so literal, did effigies come about. The relevance of this here is that perhaps rebirth can no longer be at a remove from oneself as it could afford to be later in effigies. Instead, one's person, physical and personal, has to take the plunge or be plunged, e.g., the enforced asceticism quoted by Kenner in a few moments, to be saved. Notice Phlebas forgets both the cry of gulls and the profit and loss. I've not been reading The Wasteland for so long to have finally arrived at what exactly the cry of gulls means. Naturally, the seagulls and animal types of both water and fish, so perhaps the gulls are meant simply to tie back to the Fisher King. Perhaps this cry of gulls is meant to textually be contrasted to "The nightingale filled all the desert with inviolable voice, and still she cried," at lines 100 to 102, the former belonging to the ocean, the latter the desert. Lacking my own comment, perhaps we can consider what Kenner states. The Buddhist ascetic, on the other hand, does not ask to be plucked out. He simply turns away from the senses because, as the Buddhist fire sermon states, they are each of them on fire. As for Phlebas the Phoenician, a trader sailing perhaps to Britain, his asceticism is enforced. A current undersea picked his bones and whispers. He forgets the benisons of sense, the cry of gulls and the deep sea swell, as well as the profit and loss, as he spirals down, like Dante's Ulysses, to the circling memories of his age and youth, as another chose. I believe the enforced asceticism view is valid. This part describes the usual way of becoming free from the fire of passion, not the way of self-discipline. Here the sailor is deprived of his lust for the outward beauties and the profit and loss. Sea currents pick the lust from his bones. Yet that line 313 is representing the sense field as translated into English. Buddhism, I can't say. Profit and loss is easier, however. Phlebas forgets about money now that he is dead, much like the hymn cited earlier teaches us. The concern for money is an age-old concern, and textually, the words might reference Davidson's "One song you hear in every mouth, profit and loss, profit and loss." Eliot may have been influenced by Davidson here and elsewhere in the poem. As mentioned earlier, the current connects to currents, both of which connect to profit and loss. The currents with an A are undermined by the current with an E. The rich, divinely connected life element destroys the connected with greed, transient, worldly element. As for the lines, "a current under the sea picked his bones and whispers as he rose and fell, I believe are meant to be connected to white bodies naked on the low, damp ground, and the bones cast in a little low, dry garret, rattled by the rat's foot, year to year. They are both death vignettes, yet what a difference in tone. In section 3, the death is morbid, without care, with simply generic, white naked bodies, and connected to disease, maybe even judgment, if we connect it to depictions of ruin in Old Testament prophets literature. In section 4, there's a proper noun, phlebas, and the death is, as Gish notes, the image of a cleansing death. Images of death and physical disintegration occur in quite different form than its counterpart in section 2, the image of a cleansing death. And of course this idea of cleansing is physically and spiritually important. To split the difference of these two aspects, for those familiar with Sarah Margot's novel Blindness, it has probably the best cleansing scene in all of literature. It's stronger than our lines here, but why are both effective? In Blindness and The Wasteland, when there's been so much filth up until the respective points, the cleanliness is cathartic and a borderline spiritual experience. And how does this cleanliness come about? With water. If one looks at the writings of Western mystics, e.g. Teresa of Avila's Interior Castle, Western authors, Melville's Moby Dick, specifically its more mystical chapters, or Western psychoanalysis of the water motif in religious writings, James, The Varieties of Religious Experience, or Freud's Civilization and Its Discontents, there are deep instincts which, again, take on a religious significance for this high to the point of divine treatment of water. There's also a good cleansing scene in Toni Morrison's Song of Solomon, a novel I'll mention in the Section 5 video, but that scene is different, both in function and tone. Another comment on lines 315 to 16 and 193 to 95, if Eliot intends a contrast between them. There may be a bit of wordplay irony in the word picked and cast. One would expect for the rats in section 3 to pick at the white naked bodies. Even this in keeping to some cycle of life, some relationship to nature, except the rats don't. There's not even a verb predicating the noun. The dead bodies are just there, like in a mass grave. Yet even here, bodies would be said to lie, or be piled there. The verb's absence in the poem's line removes the little agency bodies could have. The bodies certainly have no burial rights. The same for the bones, though they are cast into the garret, perhaps in the same way an effigy or anything would be cast into the waters. The rats do interact with the bones, yet it is an unfruitful or sterile interaction, and seemingly the only visit from life the bones get. Whether bodies or bones, the deaths in these vignettes amount to nothing. However, in lines 193 to 195, there the water picked at the body, bones, as if the current were a creature. Nature interacts with the dead. There is some cycle of life. The current cleanses the bones. His bones rose and fell. Unlike the little to no movement of the bones and bodies in section 3, there may even be a similar contrast between section 3's neutral or bland, year to year, contrasted to section 4's, the stages of his age and youth. And another one with the ominous and repeated rattle in lines 186 and 195, phonetically connected to the rat at line 195. All this very different from the whispers at line 316 and the softer sounds of the surrounding lines and softer tone of section 4. Granted, section 4 still has a death, yet less grim and suggestive of something, whether active or, as we will see, transformative. In ancient times, there were fears of one's body being left to the animals. Before the video's end, I will return to this thought. In lines 315 to 316, the body is left to the elements. The death in section 4 is more cleansing, in depiction and when compared to its origin in a smaller poem. The stages of his age and youth part of line 316 is more memento mori. Youth, its age and passions, is fleeting and will ultimately be destroyed. The past the stages of might mean that his life flashed before his eyes, such as is said to happen right before one passes away, and serves an important epiphanic function. Madsen in his essay on the wasteland makes an interesting observation on the age and youth phrase. He goes from age to youth as he enters the mysterious whirlpool, which represents rebirth. Thus moving in reverse, Phlebas undergoes the mortal process of transformation, age, youth, childhood, infancy, and birth. Before birth there is no life, so perhaps his death by water is a resurrection into life. I agree with his observation. We have to read the phrase as age and youth, not youth and age, and agree with the rebirth conclusion, just not the steps he takes to reach the conclusion. Going from age to youth would suggest rejuvenation, and if rejuvenation is more accurate, then Madson's quoted mortal process of age to youth would be more like Phlebas is rejuvenated to death or into death, which is inconsistent with mortal rejuvenation. Yet Phlebas' body undergoes disintegration via water, whether we read this as happening prior, because this takes place in the sentence before age and youth, or more accurately during, because this disintegration takes place as he rose and fell. Entering the whirlpool is a water version of the whirlwind. On a surface level, there's a double alliteration present with the words swell, whispers, whirlpool, wheel, and windward. I can't say I know what emotions or ideas this alliteration is meant to evoke, but it's there for those who may know. Returning to whirlwind and whirlpool, the whirlwind is rather famous in the Old Testament. It's the vehicle of Elijah's ascension into heaven. And it came to pass, as he still went on and talked, that behold, there appeared a chariot of fire, and horses of fire, and parted them both asunder, and Elijah went up by a whirlwind into heaven. And the physical incarnation, out of which the Lord's voice is heard in Job. Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind. Another such manifestation is in an Old Testament prophet's book we have yet to look at, yet one that continues the theme of the Lord's power over water. The Lord is slow to anger and great in power, and will not at all quit the wicked. The Lord hath his way in the whirlwind and in the storm, and the clouds are the dust of his feet. He rebuketh the sea, maketh it dry, and drieth up all the rivers. And finally, a proverb of retributive justice. For they have sown the wind, and they shall reap the whirlwind. It hath no stalk, the bud shall yield no meal. If so be it yield, the stranger shall swallow it up. If Eliot intends us to think on the Old Testament, which I believe he does, without limiting us to the Old Testament, here are some ideas I believe he wants us to consider. The change from whirlwind to whirlpool is simply a natural one, since the Phlebas vignette takes place underwater. It's in keeping with our elemental look at the wasteland. As opposed to being Christian, further developing Christian God symbolism, Eliot goes back, whether to Old Testament texts, such as I've tried to document, or further back, to fertility rituals, nature, the four elements. The four elements' presences are not ornate nor arbitrary in the poem. When we think of the four elements, we imagine them as this archaic model, like the humoral theory, which also incorporated the four elements. Yet even today, if we look closely at our culture and pop culture, we still cannot escape the influence and force of the four elements. Ask yourself, why are the four elements still here? In this cartoon, in this logo, in this natural remedy, in this supposed futuristic sci-fi show or movie. Why have we not progressed beyond using them? I would say the answer is for the same reason Eliot uses them in the poem, for their deep and universal appeal. Additionally, their presences function as de-Christianizing religion in the poem, going back to something pre-Christian, yet without being entirely non-Christian. At this point in section 4, there's been a death, so we have ample text to make a structural connection between section 4 and section 2. Both end with a death in water. However, section 2's death, Ophelia's lines, offer no hope. Section 4's death, with its resurrection/fertility ritual connections, has no such bleakness. If we are making Shakespeare connections, another one that Eliot would want us to make is to the Tempest, which through the wasteland we can connect to the Old Testament 2 Kings. Notice that in 2 Kings the whirlwind, is what allows for Elijah to ascend. I would say something similar is Phlebas' fate, yet straight ascension is only for the pure of spirit, for those who have released their burdens, one of which is worldly attachments, like wealth. Or to quote Silesius again, burdened one cannot advance. A sailor in a storm throws ballast overboard. Burdened with gold, you hope to enter heaven's court. Phlebas requires a transformation or sea change into death before rebirth. Returning to the Tempest, we have full fathom 5, thy father lies. Of his bones are coral made. Those were pearls that were his eyes. Nothing of him doth fade, but doth suffer a sea change into something rich and strange. Sea nymphs hourly ring his knell. Section 4 presents us with another sea change. Coincidentally enough, this adjective pair, rich and strange, is used by Weston in From Ritual to Romance. If we wish to understand clearly the evolution of the Grail story, we must realize that the simple fertility drama from which it sprung has undergone a gradual and mysterious change, which has invested it with elements at once rich and strange. The line entering the whirlpool ends Phlebas' vignette. He's gone into the whirlwind with its Old Testament echoes. Yet the whirlpool is more of a natural phenomenon and functions better this way with our elemental look at the poem. Plus, it would be overhanded of Eliot for this natural phenomenon to simply or strictly be the Old Testament Jehovah, who was typically incredibly angry and judgmental. Yet its Old Testament connotations are not meant to be entirely eliminated either. To move on, whether viewed spiritually or naturalistically, the whirlpool is a powerful force from which there is no return from. Our last three lines have a different tone. The last lines begin an address to the reader or listener. The line Gentile or Jew is rather straightforward, taking us to the New Testament. Give none offense, neither to the Jews, nor to the Gentiles, nor to the church of God, even as I please all men in all things, not seeking mine own profit, but the profit of many, that they may be saved. I take the poem's line to be a universal address, equivalent of saying, whether Christian or not, without saying, whether Christian or not. The New Testament lines also return us to the theme of money with the word profit. Notice in Paul's language, his profit is not the worldly or egotistical profit of one, instead a higher profit for all. Textually, we might be reminded of, what then? Are we better than they? No, in no wise. For we have before proved both Jews and Gentiles that they are all under sin. They are together become unprofitable. O you who turn the wheel and look to windward has two parts. The first half of this line should textually return us to hear the wheel at line 51. There we naturally connect the wheel to the traditional symbol of fate in the context of a card reading. Yet there also is a nautical connection to sailor at line 47. Notice at line 51, it is the wheel, impersonal, fatalistic. Yet at line 321, it is you who turn the wheel, suggesting volition. Seemingly the person addressed has a say in his or her fate. He or she turns the wheel of fate, or the wheel of his or her ship. Again, volition. With the wheel and nautical vignette, there may be some likeness, maybe more connotations and coincidences than intention, to the ship of state metaphor. If a valid connection, however, it is less a ship of state than a ship of the state of the soul. Be certain of this, the man who enjoys safety and security is the man in whom fear and a sense of shame abide. But wherever he's allowed to run riot and do whatever he wants, expect that this city, though at first fed by steady winds, sooner or later sinks deep down into the depths. So for me too, let a certain timely fear be fixed firmly. These things go round and round by turns. Once he was a man full of fiery insults and violent outrage, but now it's my turn. I share this text because of its similarities to section 4. Even prior to these lines from the Ajax, in line 1064 of this same speech, there's the line, he will be thrown out to become food for birds that haunt the shore. As I mentioned earlier, there was a fear of one becoming carrion in ancient times. Yet my other reason for sharing these lines, and as this video begins wrapping up, is for one to notice the difference in tones. There are other scenes, some to be shared below, with language like this one from the Ajax. And what they almost all have in common is that they're threatening and judgmental. Section 4's tone is different. Considering Section 4's likeness to previously quoted and to be quoted literary and theological passages, all of which have similar motifs and themes as Section 4, we may ask, why does Eliot offer a softer touch? There are two answers. One, I would say for relief, the type that comes from a cleansing, especially coming from Section 3. And two, is a suggestion. I believe Eliot is soft-selling a religious outlook. Without going too much into this, we can acknowledge that mainstream Christianity, the type of Christianity we are most likely to encounter, has a reputation for two approaches, either flowery love or fire and brimstone, either Jesus is love or God is going to send you to hell, and the modern audience is turned off by both, especially the latter. So as opposed to doom and gloom, which Eliot would know would turn off his audience, he instead offers a softer pitch, the content of which is not inconsistent with a religious message. This is achieved by Section 4's non-judgmental tone, and also by removing strictly Christian symbolism, or the more developed symbolism achieved in the romances, and replacing them with naturalistic elements, which are still compatible to Christian symbolism, yet subtly so. It needs to be said that the second half of line 321 does begin a warning. The Phlebas vignette served as a cautionary tale. Look to windward, I believe, returns us to whirlpool, then whirlwind, then the sow and the wind, and or reap the whirlwind of Hosea 8:7. Those unfamiliar with this verse may recognize it under the similarly worded, you reap what you sow, meaning what you invest in, good or bad, is returned unto you. Additionally, worth consideration is wind as a symbol of mutability. If we return to the Old Testament's prophet literature, we have in Ecclesiastes, he that observeth the wind shall not sow, and he that regardeth the clouds shall not reap. As he came forth of his mother's womb, naked shall he return to go as he came, and shall take nothing of his labor, which he may carry away in his hand. And this also is a sore evil, that in all points as he came, so shall he go. And what profit hath he that hath labored for the wind? To look to the wind, or to chase the wind, is futile. As a whole, the poem's line can mean, you have a say in your fate, and if you so choose to chase after futility. It admonishes, yet doesn't threaten. For those familiar with Killigrew, she also has a nice poem called An Invective Against Gold, which has the wind element, using it as a symbol of futility, and other motifs from our look at section 4. Here's a portion of her poem. Of all the poisons that fruitful earth ere yet brought forth, or monster she gave birth, naught to mankind has e'er so fatal been as thou, cursed gold, their care and sin. Methinks I the adventurous merchant see, ploughing the faithless seas in search of thee, his dearest wife and children left behind, his real wealth, while he, a slave to the wind, sometimes becalmed the shore with longing eyes, wishes to see, and what he wishes, spies. For a rude tempest wakes him from his dream, and strands his bark by a more sad extreme. Thus hopeless wretch is his whole lifetime spent, and though thrice wrecked, no wiser than he went. Again I see the heavenly fair despised, a hag like hell, with gold more highly prized. Men's faith betrayed, their prince and country sold, their God denied, all for the idle gold. Unhappy wretch, who first found out the ore, what kind of vengeance rests for thee in store. Consider Flavius, who was once handsome and tall as you, is our last line. Ricks and McHugh, in their Poems of T.S. Eliot Volume 1, connect the first word, consider, to considerate, in Inferno Canto 26, lines 118 to 120, which they got from Eliot in his Dante essay. Consider your nature. You were made not to live like beasts, but to pursue virtue and knowledge. These lines are spoken by Ulysses, for which there are a few connections, even if only coincidental, to this section. Originally, section 4 was a longer poem about sailing and shipwreck. I believe Ulysses, Odysseus, was in section 4 in some way. In Canto 26, Ulysses' last lines are about his ship being destroyed by a whirlwind. When there appeared to us a mountain, dim from distance, and it seemed to me so high, as I had never any one beheld. Joyful we were, and soon it turned to weeping, for out of the new land a whirlwind rose, and smote upon the forepart of the ship. 3 times it made her whirl with all the waters, and the 4th time it made the stern uplift, and the prow downward go, as pleased another, until the sea above us closed again. Finally, Odysseus, like Flavius, is fated to death by water. Of course this happens after Homer's Odyssey. I believe he even learns this fate from a seer, like Flavius does. For our purposes, the consider is the more important part. It establishes the tone of section 4's warning different in type and tone from that of Sosostris' warning, but also different from traditional religious teachings warnings. Sosostris' warning, as we have seen, is shallow and secular. The warnings of religious teachings, such as those of the words of Yahweh or the Old Testament prophets, are authoritative and heavy. They are not for the most part considerate, such as, think about what you're going to do, think about how this path has ended for those before you, as section 4's final lines are. For example, compare section 4 to an alternate translation of the earlier Damascus hymn. All human accomplishments are vanity, since none exist after death. Riches do not endure, glory does not come along with us. For when death comes, all these have utterly vanished. Therefore, let us cry to Christ, the immortal one, give rest to him, her, them, who have departed from us. Where are this world's pleasures? Where is the display of glories that pass away? Where are the gold and the silver? Where is the throng of the servants and their clamor? All are ashes, dust, shadows. But come, let us cry to the immortal King, Judge, him, her, them, who have departed from us. Both have the same images and themes, yet at the end of this hymn is judgment. nor is it the seemingly considerate but more like coercion of Aeschylus's "Remember, too, the storm and the wrath of the whirlwind." Or, looking at another passage, both ancient Greek and judgmental, that of the punishments found in Tartarus, such as that of Ixion, who was bound on a wheel that turned forever in the wind. The consider of section 4 is a softer touch, which fits this section's softer action and imagery. The consider is, as Gish notes in her book On the Wasteland, neither urgent nor accusing. It does not stress the power of force, nor authority of nature, nor end on the consequences of divine disobedience, like, say, the blessing and curses covenant. Instead, it returns to the human sphere, the handsome and tall, which I connect to Eugenides who, as stated earlier, is the before picture to Phlebas' after picture. However, we cannot forget the subtle qualifying once, reminding us of the human sphere's, even at its peaks, mutability. And the last word for this section is you. Again, Phlebas is a cautionary tale, yet whether we heed the warning, death is unavoidable, regardless. As Gish states, those who are now handsome and tall will share his fate and should acknowledge the significance of his death and acknowledgement of our human condition. Perhaps all of us are not handsome and tall, nor male, nor had a pocket full of currants. Yet if we can close with something on our human condition, there's this thought from Nietzsche. Everyone wants to be foremost in this future, and yet death, and the stillness of death, are the only things certain and common to all in this future. How strange that this sole thing that is certain and common to all exercises almost no influence on men, and that they are the furthest from regarding themselves as the brotherhood of death. And with this, we end not only section 4, but the 4 elements, each represented in a section that began in Burial of the Dead. It closes off the series of poems linked by the elements of earth, air, fire, and water. Not that this means the end of the from ritual to romance interpretation, nor the 4 elements. All will reappear in section 5. Looking ahead to section 5, in the West, we tend to think of the afterlife, what happens after death, as a choice between heaven and hell. Heaven and hell are contrasted, naturally, yet also unnaturally, by which I mean, keeping in mind Eliot's comments in his Baudelaire essay, yes, man, whether saint or sinner, has the capacity and choice for damnation or salvation, yet saints and sinners are larger-than-life figures. The figures we find in the epics of the Romance authors, Dante, Milton, and Homer, are not the same figures, not the same types of figures were in the Wasteland. The Wasteland is largely a poem of the unvirtuous nameless, for which even the choice of heaven would not be easy, not because such nameless are bad, but because they're uncaring. Coming from such a type, the poem's pilgrim, if heaven is his or her choice, the choice would require a test. Of course, by heaven we mean birth, because this poem's background is prehistoric religion, not Christianity, yet not entirely prehistoric religion either. There are hints of Christianity, so I can justify using the terms heaven and hell. To preview this test, I will hijack this comment by Eliot. That prospect involved, at least, discipline, inconvenience, and discomfort, but here as in hereafter, the alternative to hell is purgatory. We so frequently use this pairing of heaven and hell, yet this is rather unnatural, if not undeserving, because we, as Eliot presents the modern man in his poem, are not the heaven types. Being more realistic, the alternative to hell, as Eliot says, is purgatory. Our choice, for anyone who begins his or her pilgrimage, is between purgatory or hell. And the poem's last section, section 5, is the purgatory, test, initiation, or perilous chapel. This concludes this video's look at section 4, Death by Water. If you found this video helpful to your understanding of the Wasteland, please consider giving it a like and joining me next time.